In early 1944, the skies over Germany were a slaughterhouse for the U.S. Air Force. Week after week, dozens of B-17 bombers were shot down by the dreaded Luftwaffe. Military doctrine was rigid and clear. Escort fighters, like the P-51 Mustang, were to remain glued to the bombers, acting as passive guard dogs. However, this tactic proved to be a catastrophic failure. The experienced German pilots were calculating predators. They chose where and when to strike, diving on the formations, destroying their prey, and vanishing without a trace. The 8th Air Force was bleeding out, losing hundreds of crew members on each mission, and morale was plummeting vertiginously. It was then that its new commander, General Jimmy Doolittle, a man known for his audacity, issued an order that everyone considered suicidal madness: unleash the fighters, stop protecting the bombers, and hunt the enemy right down to the ground. It was a forbidden maneuver, a tactical heresy that would change the course of the war. Jimmy Doolittle was already a legend, but his arrival in England to command the 8th Air Force in January 1944 was met with palpable skepticism. He wasn't an aviation aristocrat, trained in traditional academies, but an engineer with a doctorate from MIT, a test pilot who pushed the limits of machines, and a strategist who saw war as a complex mathematical problem to be solved with logic and boldness. His famous raid over Tokyo in 1942, an act of near-suicidal audacity in launching medium bombers from an aircraft carrier, had shown the world that he wasn't afraid to break every rule to achieve an objective. Upon arriving in England, he encountered a doctrine he considered archaic and dangerously ineffective. Generals and planners in Washington and England insisted that the fighters' sole role was close escort, an invisible umbilical cord that kept them tethered to the slow and vulnerable bombers. The logic, seemingly solid, was to protect the investment, the valuable aircraft and their 10-man crews. Doolittle, however, dove into combat reports, lost statistics, and conversations with exhausted and traumatized pilots, quickly identifying the fundamental flaw in that defensive logic. "We're not escorting, we're being hunted like prey," he wrote in a memo that shocked the high command. He argued that by flying in defensive formation, the Allies were completely ceding the initiative to the enemy. The Luftwaffe could mass in large numbers out of the escort's reach, select the weakest point in the bomber formation, and attack with overwhelming force, while the P-51 Mustangs, fighters with superior speed and firepower, were forced to fly in circles like impotent spectators, awaiting the inevitable assault. The solution he proposed was radical, almost insubordinate. He ordered the fighters unleashed to fly far ahead of the bomber formations in an aggressive and predatory fighter sweep. They were to seek and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it was, in the air as it climbed to intercept, or even on the ground at their own airfields. Attacking an enemy on the ground was a violation of the unwritten rules of aerial combat, an act considered unchivalrous and extremely dangerous. But Doolittle wasn't interested in gentleman's honor. He was interested in mathematical results. With the Normandy invasion, D-Day, on the horizon, time was running out. If air supremacy wasn't achieved, and quickly, the greatest military operation in history would be a disaster. His order, issued against the will of many, would rewrite the rules of aerial combat forever, transforming the hunted into hunters. The morning of March 6, 1944, was cold and gray at the air bases in England. In the briefings, fighter pilots from P-51 Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt groups heard the new order directly. No more close escort. The mission was simple and terrifying: fly ahead, find the enemy, and annihilate it wherever it was. The reaction in the briefing rooms was an explosive mix of shock, fear, and a restrained euphoria that was almost palpable.
For months, they had felt like leashed dogs, watching helplessly as bombers were torn apart by Bf-109s and FW-190s. Now, the leash had been removed. As the massive formation of over 700 B-17 bombers headed for Berlin, a target considered nearly untouchable and a suicidal journey until then, the fighter squadrons surged ahead, ravenous for combat. Doolittle's plan was executed with impressive ferocity. Instead of waiting for German fighters to climb into battle on their own terms, American pilots dove like falcons on airfields at Gardelegen, Quedlinburg, and Oschersleben. The radio channel, which had previously been a constant stream of panic with desperate calls like bandits at 6 o'clock were taking hits, now exploded with triumphant adrenaline-fueled reports. "Runway in flames! Hangar hit!" shouted one pilot, his voice vibrating with the thrill of the hunt. Another reported almost breathless, "Got 3 on the ground. Repeat, 3 destroyed before takeoff." For the Germans, it was an unprecedented tactical and psychological shock. They were accustomed to a combat ritual, climbing calmly, forming up at an altitude superior to the bombers, and then diving for the kill with deadly precision. That day, the war came to their doorstep before they could even start their engines. Mechanics scrambled for cover as Mustangs streaked in at low level, their 8.50 caliber machine guns shredding parked aircraft, fuel trucks, and the Luftwaffe's morale itself. By the end of that week, known among American pilots as the Big Week, the German Air Force had lost nearly 500 aircraft, many of them destroyed on the ground. Even more devastating was the loss of hundreds of pilots, including many Experten, the veteran aces who were the irreplaceable backbone of the Jagdwaffe. The blow was so sudden and brutal that German command took days to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. They hadn't just lost a battle, they had lost control of their own skies. Doolittle's heretical audacity had worked, and that first strike was just the beginning of the end. The March 6th strike wasn't an isolated event. It was the start of a hemorrhage that the Luftwaffe couldn't staunch. The dark genius of Doolittle's strategy was recognizing that the most valuable target wasn't German factories, but their weakest and most irreplaceable resource, their experienced pilots. Germany, despite relentless bombings, still possessed formidable industrial capacity to build fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190. What it lacked was time, fuel, or instructors to create pilots capable of flying those complex machines against swarms of Allied fighters that now dominated the skies. Before Doolittle's change, a German pilot underwent a rigorous training program lasting over a year, logging hundreds of flight hours in various aircraft before seeing combat. These were the Experten, men who knew every nuance of their aircraft in aerial combat. They were artists of death, sky predators. But from March 1944 onward, the attrition rate became unsustainable. The veteran aces, the backbone of the Luftwaffe, were being hunted and killed at an alarming rate by P-51s that now roamed German airspace freely, turning the Reich into their personal hunting ground. To fill the gaps left by these veterans, the German training program was drastically shortened and compromised. Novice pilots, many with fewer than 150 total flight hours and almost no simulated combat experience, were thrown into the cockpits of high-performance fighters. The growing fuel shortages, ironically caused by the same bombings that now reached their targets more safely, meant they could barely train. These terrified young men took off and died on their first or second missions, often without firing a shot, easy prey for experienced American pilots. The legendary German ace Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, watched the disaster unfold and desperately confronted the Luftwaffe chief, Hermann Göring. Galland warned that the air war was lost, that his best men were dying to protect pilots who could barely fly. Göring, living in a world of denial and fury, accused his pilots of cowardice, refusing to accept that a simple enemy tactical change had rendered his once proud and invincible Luftwaffe obsolete. Intercepted German reports described the growing despair. Pilot losses far exceed our replacement capacity. We fly in fear. Doolittle's strategy had transformed the Luftwaffe from an elite hunter force into a herd being systematically culled.
Fighter freedom, however, didn't come cheap. Doolittle's new tactic was incredibly effective, but also incredibly dangerous for his own men. Flying close escort was passive and frustrating, but relatively safe, with fighters shielded by the mass of defensive fire from over 10,000 guns on the bombers. Free hunting, and especially strafing, the machine gunning of ground targets, was a steel nerves gamble played mere feet from death. Diving on heavily defended airfields and railroads put P-51 and P-47 pilots in the deadly range of flak, the feared German anti-aircraft artillery. 20mm and 37mm cannons, often hidden in camouflaged positions in woods, barns, and church towers, spat a hell of explosive shells that filled the air. A single hit on the vulnerable liquid-cooled engine of the P-51, the cooling system, or the pilot himself could be instantly fatal. The extremely low altitude of attack runs left no margin for error. There was no time or height to bail out if the plane was struck. The pilot either died in the air or on impact with the ground. In the first weeks of the new tactic, losses among the 8th Air Force's fighter groups rose by a shocking 20%. Experienced pilots, squadron leaders who were the backbone of the American fighter force, were lost on these daring missions. Within Allied command itself, criticism of Doolittle mounted. Some generals, in private and in memos, accused him of being reckless and ruthless, of sacrificing his precious fighters and pilots on high-risk missions that, they argued, should have been the job of medium bombers. They contended that the cost in fighter pilots, who took time and resources to train, was simply too high. Doolittle, however, stood firm, with the coolness of an engineer analyzing data in a spreadsheet. He knew he was fighting a war of attrition and that the math, though brutal, was in his favor. He was trading, on average, 1 American fighter pilot for 3 German pilots and 10 enemy aircraft destroyed on the ground. And the results were undeniable and irrefutable. Before March 1944, a bombing mission could cost up to 60 B-17 bombers, meaning the loss of 600 men in a single afternoon. After implementing the new tactic, bomber losses dropped to an average of fewer than 7 per mission. Doolittle was sacrificing a few to save many. The price was terribly high, but the price of inaction would have been defeat in the air war and, possibly, the failure of the European invasion. By the summer of 1944, the transformation of the European skies was total and terrifying for Germany. The Luftwaffe, which for years had been the symbol of overwhelming power and Nazi pride, was now a ghost, a broken and demoralized force that could barely defend its own territory. The shrill and distinctive sound of Merlin engines in P-51 Mustangs became the daily soundtrack of German defeat, a noise that echoed from bombed-out cities to the most remote fields. For German civilians, the change was visceral and frightening. Air raid sirens, which had once announced the arrival of bomber formations that would be fiercely contested by Luftwaffe heroes, now wailed like a funeral dirge for an uncontested assault. People looked to the sky and, instead of seeing smoke trails from air battles, saw swarms of silver fighters flying with absolute arrogance, diving to attack trains, bridges, trucks, and anything that moved. The myth of the Reich's invincibility was unraveling in real time, not by distant ground armies, but by enemy pilots thousands of feet in the air, acting with total impunity. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe pilots themselves was even more devastating. Morale, already low, simply evaporated. Intelligence reports and interrogations of captured pilots spoke of men who refused to take off, claiming non-existent mechanical failures, or who climbed and immediately fled at the first sign of American fighters. They knew they were being sent to near certain death, outnumbered, outskilled, and flying on low-quality fuel. In a final act of desperation that symbolized total collapse, the Luftwaffe created units like Sonderkommando Elbe. These were suicide attack squadrons, made up of young volunteers, many under 20, flying stripped-down Bf-109 fighters, devoid of armor and with minimal armament. Their sole and terrible mission was to deliberately ram Allied bombers, a medieval ramming attack in a futile attempt to stem the tide of steel. On April 7, 1945, over 120 of these young pilots were sent on a single mission,
Most were shot down by escorting P-51s before they could even get close to the bombers. It was a futile sacrifice, the last gasp of an Air Force that was already clinically dead. The collapse wasn't just military, it was the breaking of a spirit, the public humiliation of a myth. Doolittle's tactical madness didn't just destroy planes, it destroyed the very soul of the Luftwaffe.
The strategic importance of Jimmy Doolittle's decision transcends the statistics of air battles. It was the key that unlocked the door to Europe's liberation. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, was unequivocal in his condition for launching Operation Overlord, the Normandy invasion. He demanded total and absolute air supremacy over the landing area. Without it, the largest invasion fleet in history would be terribly vulnerable to devastating Luftwaffe attacks, and the operation would be doomed to failure. Imagine the alternative scenario. Thousands of ships carrying hundreds of thousands of soldiers slowly crossing the English Channel, and on the Normandy beaches, men fighting desperately to establish a secure beachhead. If the Luftwaffe had still been at the height of its strength, as it was in 1943, it could have turned the beaches and channel waters into a hell of bombs and machine gun fire. Focke-Wulf fighter bombers and Junkers bombers could have sunk troop transports, destroyed supporting naval artillery, and mercilessly strafed soldiers pinned on the sand with nowhere to hide. D-Day could have become the Allies' greatest military disaster before the 1st Division could even advance inland. Thanks to Doolittle's campaign of annihilation, begun in March, that nightmare never materialized. In the 3 crucial months leading up to the invasion, April, May, and June 1944, the Luftwaffe was systematically hunted, dismantled, and eradicated from the skies over France. When Allied troops finally landed on the beaches of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword on June 6, 1944, the sky above them was almost entirely free of enemy aircraft. Instead of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts, soldiers looked up and saw the black and white invasion stripes on Allied P-51s, P-47s, and Spitfires patrolling and protecting the airspace. The German Air Force, on its most critical day, managed little more than 100 sorties against the massive invasion fleet, a pathetically small and completely ineffective number. Doolittle's campaign didn't just destroy the Luftwaffe's fighting capability, it left it blind and paralyzed. Strafing missions also destroyed radar stations and communication centers, preventing German command from grasping the scale and exact location of the invasion in time to react. One general's madness in sacrificing his fighters had created an impenetrable air shield over Normandy, protecting the soldiers at their most vulnerable moment and ensuring that the first step toward Hitler's defeat was a resounding success. The legacy of Jimmy Doolittle and his forbidden maneuver extends far beyond the destruction of the Luftwaffe. It is a timeless and powerful lesson on the power of disruptive innovation and the courage to challenge established dogma. In 1943 and early 1944, Allied military thinking was trapped in a snare of its own making, a defensive and reactive doctrine that was leading directly to defeat in the strategic air war. Doolittle didn't win the air war by inventing a better plane or a new technological gadget. He won with an idea, a paradigm shift. He had the clarity of an engineer to realize that the enemy's true center of gravity wasn't its aircraft factories, which could be rebuilt, but its far more fragile system, its experienced pilots, its training program, its fuel supply, and ultimately its morale. And he had the audacity to attack that system directly and relentlessly, even if it meant breaking every established rule and risking his own career. His philosophy was the antithesis of military bureaucracy, which often values procedure over results. Where other generals saw sacred rules, he saw constraints leading to failure. Where others saw unacceptable risk to their fighter pilots, he saw a strategic opportunity to break the enemy's backbone. His decision to unleash the fighters was in essence an act of strategic insubordination,
based on the cold and logical analysis that the current approach was failing catastrophically and that radical change was the only way out. He proved that in times of crisis, blind adherence to tradition and the way we've always done things is infinitely more dangerous than the boldest innovation. After the war, Doolittle remained an influential figure, advocating for an independent air force and the development of ballistic missile technology, always looking to the future of air power. His reputation remained ambiguous to some, the reckless general who risked his men, but to history, he is the architect of air victory in Europe. The story of the mad general is a powerful reminder that progress, whether in war, business, or science, rarely comes from those who follow the safe path. It comes from those who dare to look at a problem everyone accepts as unsolvable and ask, what if we do the unthinkable? In the silence that followed the roar of engines over a ruined Europe, the answer was clear. The unthinkable, in the hands of a courageous visionary, can change the world.